Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Yachats Commons. This is a program of the Yachats Academy of Arts and Sciences, abbreviated to the Academy. We were using Yaz for a while, and people didn't think that was such a hot name, so we're going to refer to it as the Academy. We've done 3 or 4 events, and the idea is to have an event a month and to take advantage of some of the expertise that we have right in our own community, scientific, artistic. And so we have been planning several events all the way through March, April of next year. In September, Stacy Harper will give a presentation on nanotechnology. Phyllis Steves, who is here now, is the archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service in this area. She will give us a talk. Matt Love, who writes for Coast Today and is a English professor at Newport High School, was the caretaker for the Cascade Head Wildlife Area for 10 years, and author of several books, will be here in November. Solstice event, December 21st, which is a Tuesday evening, big bonfire out by the picnic shelter, and a whole bunch of events leading up to that bonfire solstice event, including the holiday celebration in Yachats. All of these will be printed out, a whole schedule of events. So that's some of the things we have planned. I've known Jim and his wife Ursula for almost 30 years. I was trying to think how to introduce him. And one experience that stands out in my mind is we used to get together and play poker on a very regular basis. Jim is the only poker player I know that doesn't bluff. 2 cards down, he looks at them and folds. This is a nickel, dime, quarter game. Say, Jim, put in a nickel. Come on. The problem is when he holds them, and then holds the next one, you don't know what he's up to. And I've called his bluff a couple times, and they're good hands, very good hands, and he wins. So Jim has been involved in many activities. He was on the Lincoln County Planning Commission for a while. He still serves on the Lincoln Land Legacy Committee. And they make decisions on protecting various properties, lands here in Lincoln County. They've been instrumental in the conservation easement on the Cattell property by the Amanda Trail, and also on the Gerdeman Botanical Preserve. So most of you know Jim and Ursula, so please let's give Jim a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Academy and the Friends for sponsoring these things. They're great. I missed the last one. I'm not going to miss the next one. And if you take nothing else away from this today, I would like you all to remember that Adler never bluffs. That's a really valuable reputation. When Jerry Kimmel approached me a number of months ago about presenting water quality monitoring to a group of people, I thought, why not? I mean, I put people to sleep for years talking about it, and this would be a personal best to do it to a whole room. And then I thought, well, this isn't about my personal best, so I might as well try and make it interesting. And as it is the Academy of Arts and Sciences, I thought I'm more artist than I am scientist. So I wanted to tell you a story. And the story is how I came to be an environmentalist. That, in and of itself, isn't terribly interesting, except that I believe that it is typical of the experience of a lot of us who lived around here, who have become real environmentalists. I mean, like Paul Engelmeyer and Chuck Willer and the Van Strums, and people who have had a huge effect on, national politics, and certainly through the state. And I'm not saying I'm one of them. I happen to be in the same kind of position at about the same time. And what occurred to me in thinking about the whole group of us is that we all kind of got stuck. That we found ourselves caught doing something that we couldn't get out of. And we had to continue because we became kind of the only people who could do it. And ultimately, I mean, for a few of them, it became, I mean, like for Paul and Chuck, it became a lifetime, and they became extremely effective at what they're doing. They are, you know, at the very head of a lot of environmental endeavors. I have been in and out of it, and I'd like to tell you my experience, which is kind of emblematic of all of ours. And first, let me start with a metaphor, and that is, imagine that you are sitting on a mountaintop in the Coast Range, and it's a gorgeous day. You are looking out over the valley, and it's perfectly clear, and you can see forever, and you look around on the other side, and you can look down the hills, and you can turn around and see the ocean. And way down, way across the valley, you see a train coming up the valley, and it's going in and out of the contours and slowly chugging its way up toward you. And you look and you see the tracks down next to the river around you, and goes around to the river and then crosses the river on the trestle. And suddenly you look at the trestle, and you realize that it's been washed away. The rails are hanging down into the river. The ties are floating along in the next to the rocks. And you realize that that train that is coming toward you is going to fall in the river. So you run down into town, and you run into the door of the train agency, and you tell the people, the trestle's down. There's going to be a train wreck. You have to do something. And they say, no. That trestle was designed by the best engineers in the world. It is inspected regularly. There is absolutely nothing the matter with it. And you say, no, I just saw it. I just saw it. There is nothing there. The train is going through it. And they say, no, it can't happen. So then you do what any sensible person would do in that situation, is you start screaming. And you start screaming, it's going to be a train wreck. There is going to be a train wreck. And as you're screaming, there are people outside who hear you, and they start saying, train wreck? There's going to be a train wreck? That is the precise moment at which you become a bigger problem than the train wreck. I live 3 miles up the Ohio River. My neighbor across the road is Dyke Dame, who owns the Oreo cookie cows. You know those? My neighbor to the east raises bears. For those of you who don't know, there's a woman who feeds bears, or fed bears, up the river. Dyke came up to me in 1989, and he was very agitated because some guys in orange vests were surveying on his property. And when he went down to ask them what they were doing, they told him that they were surveying for a point of diversion on the river that the city of Yachats was going to use for a pumping station to take more water out of the river for municipal use. And Dyke was agitated first off because they were on his property and hadn't asked, so he thought that was rather rude. And also, both of us knew that the river got rather low. That we wondered, how much water can you take out of the river? And will it be okay? So we both went to the city, and we asked the superintendent of public works what this was all about. And he said, don't worry. It's only a 2 CFS right that we're asking for. We don't need it now. We probably will never need it. And it's not going to be much. A CFS is 633,000 gallons a day. Yeah, it's, what is that? That's 450 gallons a minute. So I stopped worrying about it. Dyke didn't. Dyke started inquiring, and he contacted the Water Resources Department, and he contacted Oregon Trout and people who knew about these things, and he essentially assembled a file because he wanted to know what was going to happen when the city took this water out. I was completely sold out. I didn't care. So I just minded my own business and kept on going until 1992, when the city actually got their permit, and Dyer came up with the file and said, we have to do something about this, because they actually are going to be taking water out of the river. And I started looking at his file, and one of the first things I noticed, there was a record of all of the measurements of the amount of water in the river from 1925 on. And there were only like 12 of them. And I noticed that none of them were in September or October when the river was its lowest. I thought, well, that's odd. And so I called Water Resources and asked them, well, so how much water is in the river? You know, I mean, if you're going to be giving 2 CFS to the city of Yachats, how much is going to be left? And they said, oh, enough. I said, well, looking at the water rights that you've issued, it seems to me like you've got more water being taken out of the river than there is river. They said, no, that can't happen. They did say that the river was over-appropriated, but they didn't say that, you know, that it could be dried up. So, of course, I mean, that got my curiosity. I mean, it occurred to me, as it had occurred to Dyer, that these people might not know what they're doing, and that they were just issuing permits without really knowing whether or not there was going to be enough water to satisfy them. So I started checking around to find out if anybody else had read the river, and I found the Water Resources Research Institute at OSU had done a projection study of river levels on the coast. For some reason, I can never find out what it was. But I found out under Yachats that it was projected to have a low flow of 8 CFS. You're going to take a quarter of that. It seemed like an awful lot. I mean, considering we had seen the river fairly low, and if they were going to take a quarter of it, I mean, you're going to see a lot of rock. So, from about 92 to 94 or something, I started asking around to people. I really didn't know. I mean, can you really harm a river by taking out, obviously you can harm by taking out all the water, but you know, how low can it get? And I found a man by the name of Mark Campbell, who was a PhD water biologist who had been doing a study down at 10 Mile. And I asked him, what happens to rivers if you get them too low? And his response was, you can do it on a fairly regular basis for short periods of time. But if you do it on a regular basis over a long period of time, you can really wreck the river. It will never recover. Never recover. And he referred me to a man who at the time was a fisheries biologist at the Forest Service. And I went and asked him, you know, so what do you know? And he said something that really kind of determined my life for the next 15 years. He said that rivers can get to a point, if you take too much water out of them, they begin to consume themselves. And that knocked me over. I couldn't live with that phrase. I was imagining, well, what happened if we are screwing up here? And we are taking too much water out of this river, and we actually end up destroying it. Somebody should probably take a look at this. Well, I went back to Water Resources and said, you know, is there the possibility that we're taking too much water out of this river? You know, and they said, no, absolutely not. And even if there were, Yachats has a right now. It is a property right. The way that Oregon water system works, it's a rather arcane system, is that, first off, you may own the land under a river system. And like up the river, the adjoining property owners will own to the middle of the river. They own the property underneath it. All of the water in the river is owned by the state. All of the surface water in the state is owned by the state. And you have to apply for a water right in order to use it. Once you have that right, it's yours. It goes with the land. It is inviolate. If you keep to the original restrictions that are put on your permit, you may use it as you wish. It's a great thing to have, but it's a real problem if it was issued wrongly, which I think the city of Yachats was. It was, the application it said for emergency purposes only. What's that mean? No fire? No, it means when they ran out of water. No. And actually at that time, the city of Yachats was running out of water. I don't know, some of you may remember that there were restrictions put on water use in the mid-90s. That, you had to, you couldn't water outside, you couldn't wash your car, you couldn't, there were all kinds of, you were limited to X number of gallons a month. And Yachats was getting ready to perfect their right to put their pumping system onto the river in order to get more water. Well, first off, Dyke and I were really curious as to, well, why, just like 3 years ago, they said, oh no, don't worry about it. We got lots of water. Everything's just fine. And all of a sudden, they're putting water controls on everybody and saying, you can't take the water out because we don't have enough. The two water systems that the city used before, there's one, Reedy Creek, which is about 3 miles up the river, and then there's Salmon Creek, which runs through the water treatment plant. Most of you know that. And Reedy Creek, as far as we could see, was flowing like crazy. You'd see it running under the road, and it was, a nice, healthy-looking system, and your house didn't have any water. Well, the line from Reedy Creek to the water treatment plant was losing half of its water in the ground. That was a problem. When it came to the plant and got treated and sent out to the people who were using it in town, they were losing another 65% of that. I accidentally brought this up at a city council meeting because I was so dumbfounded by these figures that I kind of blurted out. Actually, I didn't blurt it out. Somebody blurted it out for me. I had shown it to somebody else, and she said, well, how about Jim Adler's figures on, how much water you're letting? I don't know. and they said, what's Jim Adler know? And I gave them my figures, and the superintendent of public works said, oh, that's awful. I said, you mean you don't? Don't you take the amount of water that you send out of the plant and then subtract the amount of water that you're billing to see how much water actually gets to the faucets? No, we don't do that. I said, well, if you did, you'd see that 65% of it was going into the ground. And it was a shock for me to find out that they didn't know about that. And then it occurred to me, of course, that they were heavily getting into diverting this extra 2 CFS from the river in order to make up for the amount that they were losing in both the transmission and the distribution lines. And that because they couldn't find the leaks were going to increase. And there was going to be a continuing need for more and more water, which means that they would be applying for more rights out of the river if they couldn't fix it. So we started asking the obvious question, what are you going to do about this? What will the city do to keep from having a constantly increasing need for more water? We never got an answer. Fortunately, and this is where by this time I was stuck because, I had been asking all of these questions of the city and getting no response. And going to the Water Resources Department, I thought, you have this notion, if you haven't been involved in environmental stuff, that there is somebody who is keeping an eye on all of this. That the state regulates, the state takes care of these things. And if you get to the proper department and you talk to the right people, they'll say, oh, of course, we'll fix it. Well, I didn't have that experience. I ended up in Water Resources, And the people would say, I mean, the people that I would talk to would say, yeah, that's really awful. They really should do something about that. I mean, they should fix their pipes before they get more water. I said, well, you know, how are they going to do it? Well, we can't do it. It's a water right. Well, so they are allowed to pour all of the water into the ground and keep on asking for more water, and you have to keep on giving it? Well, that's not the way we put it. But essentially, yeah. There was one requirement that Yachats had placed on their, or one of the many requirements that was placed on their permit, which was to submit a water conservation management plan to the state before they were going to be allowed to get into the river. This was a new thing. They had never required this of anybody, of any municipalities before, or they've required very few. And this was essentially to show the state that they were doing long-range water planning, and that there was an attempt to conserve water. Because what had happened in the interim, well, two things. The first was the listing of the coho salmon. And the Yachats was coho habitat. So we were getting the attention of the federal government, which of course got the attention of the state, because the state did not want the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be telling everybody in the state how to manage their business. The state of Oregon had to write a salmon plan, a plan for conserving endangered species within its borders. The other thing, well, let me further get into this further. This Governor Kitzhaber was calling all of his department heads into the office weekly and asking them, what were you doing about salmon? And I guess Water Resources was telling them something. I don't know what they were saying, but you know, they had to say something. And there was now the need to conserve water in the rivers. There was a legal need to conserve water, because if somebody could show U.S. Fish and Wildlife that the state was not upholding its bargain to do something about salmon habitat, there would be the possibility that the federal government would take back this ability to govern the state's waters. So we had that. And we could go to Water Resources and say, hey, you know, you can't grant this right if you're going to be emptying a river which has endangered species in it. So there is this archetypal scenario of you know, anytime somebody wants to do something, the loggers, I mean, you know, there's always the environmentalist out in the brush waiting to jump on them. Well, that was me. And I spent the next 3 years essentially jumping on the city. That every time that they would put out a new iteration of the Water Conservation Management Plan, I would spend months trashing it. And fortunately, it was very easy. The problem was they didn't want to hire somebody to do it, so they got a man in town, a retired engineer, to write this plan for them. And it was a daunting task, because this guy had to somehow or another hide the amount of water that was being lost and to project that this was going to be put to a beneficial use down the road. And what it showed up as was, like in 2020, all of the motels were built, and they all had 3 people in every room. And all of the houses were built, and they all had like 5 people in them. And there were huge numbers of people in town, and they were all, every single one of them, consuming 311 gallons of water a day. Go Yachats. It made that fun to trash that. But what really surprised me was I would do my notes on it, which I was going to be submitting to Water Resources, and I would send it out to all the various agencies who had some kind of interest in this. And almost inadvertently, Yachats became a focal point for a lot of water issues. I mean, I got No, I got novels back from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service. They actually reviewed all these plans and would send back these huge masses of notes about the Yachats water system. I was astounded. I had no idea we were that important. And only later would I find out why. But still, despite the fact that we had absolutely impenetrable reasoning, we had lots of major players on our side, Water Resources was preparing to approve the Water Conservation Management Plan and allow the city to go ahead and withdraw the water without doing anything about their leakage problem. Fortunately, somebody made a big mistake. Water Resources, actually it was a very clever mistake, which ended up being really stupid. Water Resources, somebody in Water Resources came to the city and said, I got a way for you to get out from under them. What you do is you put a little pump station right in front of the water treatment plant on Salmon Creek, and you pump water from the river directly in front of the treatment plant. What that would allow you to do is, once we approve your plan, you don't need to get access to your upper point of diversion, because you can bring water right into the plant, and you can perfect your right on both of those points of diversion, and you're done. You've gotten them out of your hair. There's nothing more they can do. They are legally dead. It was brilliant. There were only a couple of problems. One, it was salt water. They were taking water out of the estuary. And I don't believe, the superintendent of public works, I mean, years later I said, didn't you test that? And he said, yeah, but it was clean. I mean, it was good water. I said, you must have done it at a low tide. Because when the tide comes in, that estuary is completely filled with salt water. And also, the upper point of diversion had a small problem involved with it. That it was on private land that the city had bought an easement from a timber company, but they had to get across about 100 feet of Forest Service land in order to access it, which was the problem with why they couldn't just get in there and just put the pump station in. The Forest Service, because they weren't crazy to have this happen, said, well, fine, I mean, we will grant you an access permit, but you must do an environmental analysis. Nobody wants to do an EA. And the city particularly didn't want to do it, because essentially, I mean, the burden of proof is on them to show that their action was not going to cause any harm to the river. So this idea of going into the estuary was perfect for them. They could get away from that requirement. Well, with all of this pissing match going on, what we were looking for was an entree to the courts. And we had to wait for an action. What we were actually waiting for was for the city to get their plan approved, some way or another, and then try to access the river, at which time we would say, okay, we're going to district court. But this thing of changing their point of diversion, it says in the law, you may change a point of diversion. They added a point of diversion. And we said, no. When you change something, you give up the thing that you had. No. Our change is we're going to add it. So we went to Water Resources with every dictionary we could find, from legal dictionaries, and we said, look, change means you get rid of the last one, right? Change means, change. And they said, dictionary? We don't need no stinking dictionary. Change means add. We had a great defeat, and we also had entree to the courts. That was a challengeable action. So 5 of us Me, Andrea Scharf, Ron Taves, Paul Engelmeyer, Dyke Dame, and Water Watch of Oregon ended up suing the state. I never really expected to be in that situation. It's a little daunting, because, the Attorney General is going to be defending them. And Water Watch, which is a service agency dedicated to keeping water in rivers, had a great attorney, which we depended upon entirely. I had to write half the brief, and then she actually, made it legible. And we were headed toward district court to bring an action against the state for essentially not obeying their own rules. Once we got into court, of course, we could discuss anything we wanted. So we figured, okay, we'll get through this one little thing. Part of getting into district court involved going through an administrative hearing, that we had to go in front of an administrative law judge and clear that. And if we weren't satisfied with the decision there, then of course we could continue with our case and go on to district court. And I thought, boy, talk about a colossal waste of time. I mean, we are going to be sitting trying to convince an employee of the Water Resources Department that their rules are being badly interpreted. And what's the likelihood of their finding in our favor? Well, we showed up, we dressed up, we showed up, and they showed up, and the Attorney General showed up, and we stated our case and laid out what we thought were a reasonable set of demands. And the judge said, we're going to go into negotiation here. We want you folks to work this out amongst yourselves. That we want you to come to some kind of a negotiated settlement so that we don't have to continue this as a legal matter. And we said, terrific. And we went out to lunch, and they went out to lunch, and I swear I wasn't eavesdropping. But when I came back into the building, the Attorney General was yelling at the city and telling them that they were going to accept whatever we offered. Well, I was in shock. We went back into the room, and the city said, we'll sign. Huh? And we signed a negotiated settlement with the city, which involved a whole bunch of requirements, like that they bring their water system efficiency up to 85%, that they do a curtailment plan, which is based on stream flows, that as the stream flows get lower, that the city starts to lower its demand, that it write a new permit, that we have like 7 or 8 demands in there. And they said, fine, we'll do that. Only then did I discover what was really going on. And it wasn't about Yachats at all. This whole thing, this inability of the Water Resources Department to do the right thing despite the fact that they knew what it was being driven by Salem, Woodburn, Medford, Grants Pass, Klamath Falls, all who had the same situation as Yachats. They were looking for more water because the water that they had was being leaked into the ground, and they didn't want or couldn't fix their pipes. The difference with them was they had lots of lawyers. And this was going to cause a real problem for the state, because the state had very little money. They couldn't fight these folks. If we were to get into district court and to get the ruling that we wanted, which we expected to do, and I think the state probably expected we were going to do, that ruling then could have been applied to virtually all of those cities in the state. This was chaos for the state, that they just couldn't countenance that. So the solution was, keep us out of district court, which is why the Attorney General was yelling at the city of Yachats. They dodged a bullet. Actually, when I found out about this, I was thinking, we could just refuse this settlement and just go ahead, and keep on pushing it. My friends looked at me like, go ahead. We signed, and we did what was necessary to get out from under what had happened. That kind of was the end of it, to some degree or another. I mean, we had gotten what we wanted. We had gotten what we thought was a reasonable settlement. There was a new permit issued, which was tied to our settlement, and said that all of those negotiated articles had to be satisfied before the city could take any water. And actually, the city that I'm talking about was the city of like the mid-90s. We're living in an entirely different city now. I mean, they got a superintendent of public works on board who almost immediately started fixing all the pipes. The last I heard, I think it was talking about like in the low 90s efficiency for the distribution system, which is, although it's not unheard of, that's terrific. I mean, we thought that we were being unreasonable asking for 85%. And that cities never have 85% efficiency of water delivery. Well, City of Yachats did it. And they've done all kinds of other things, including fund our water quality monitoring, much to the chagrin of a few people. During the latter part of that period, it got very unfriendly. It got personal, which was difficult. As part of the whole process, I was trying to be helpful. I mean, we were looking for other water sources. We were looking for means of conserving water. We were looking for water storage. We were looking for anything that would get us out of this hole that we were in, including consolidation with other systems. And there was a plan to consolidate the entire county on a single water source, Rocky Creek up near Depot Bay, and that it would be managed by Lincoln City and Newport and then feed everybody else in the county. We would be able to get off of all of the systems that we had by using just one system, have massive amounts of storage, and it would be a wonderful thing. It didn't work. But as part of it, we had consolidation hearings between Yachats, Southwest Lincoln, the next system up, and Waldport. And that actually produced something pretty good. We have intergovernmental agreements. We connected all of the lines between all of them. We now have kind of mutual aid that, if somebody's short, then it can be supplied by another. That worked very well. But during those hearings, the representative from Water Resources came up to me and said, "What'd you do to the mayor?" What? He says, "What did you do to the mayor of Yachats?" I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, he pulled me aside at the break, and he said that you were the devil." This guy was a professor emeritus of religious philosophy, and he was a deacon of the church, and he knew very well right and wrong. And I figured, I mean, if this guy thinks I'm the devil, well, he's kind of an authority. So I called my mom. And I told her this, and her response was that it was very unlikely. But it got very nasty, and I didn't appreciate that at all. And I had to get even by doing a public show about him. Just after that, the city hired a professional engineering group to do a water master plan, which they did quite well. It was accepted by the city. It includes all of the things that they have to do in order to take water out of the river. The city is still committed to taking water out of the river. That they spent $25,000 a couple of years ago in order to satisfy one of the requirements, which was to monitor the levels of water in the river, which is something that we needed them to do before they started taking the water out. I guess they put it in a monitor, and what the public work director was telling me was that some fishermen destroyed it. And, which is too bad, because we'd like to know, I mean, we've been measuring right above that for 10 years, and I would like to know, you know, how close we are to their numbers. After this all kind of cooled down, DEQ started going up and down the coast looking for people to do water quality monitoring in the coastal streams. They were required by the Clean Water Act of 1972, signed by our last great environmental president, Richard Nixon, to study all of the surface water in your state to determine what were the water quality limiting factors of that water, to propose a remedy, and then to do what they call TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. They're talking about places, you know, like the Cuyahoga River, where they have, you know, all kinds of junk flowing down the river, and they have to come up with a figure, how much mercury can this river take, you know, in terms of the total maximum daily load of things inhibiting water quality. But you get out here, we don't have that. But they still had to do the water quality analysis, and they had to do the remedies, and they had to do the TMDLs. And although we were not hired to do that, we were trained to get them enough information to be able to see where the hot spots were, and to be able to go back and do their own stuff. Well, they came out and trained us twice, because the first time didn't take very well. And gave us a bunch of instruments, which we had a lot of fun with. And then we got serious about it. And we set up a really good, we set up a great lab, for one thing. We had like 4 people who were working together, or 5 people who were working to do the analysis in the labs. And we started into a 10-year study in the year 2000 to actually get a snapshot of what the water quality in this river looked like. Now, there was a guy up north who wrote a letter to the city saying, why would you give money to these people to come up with evidence to cause you trouble? What could be going through your head that you would want to fund this group? And he was right. But there was something else. When I decided that I was going to become project manager for this, I did not want to answer a question. DEQ said, well, you have to ask the question, you have to answer it. And that sounded really stupid to me, because of course you're going to answer the question you want to answer, and you're going to find ways to do it. It's kind of like, you know, you make the study so that you're going to come up with the kind of conclusions you want. I wanted to do a study which would just take a look at the basic parameters, and then every time that we found an anomaly, every time that we found something odd, we would write another study and follow that. So we would allow what we were looking at to determine what we would be looking at. And we wouldn't have an end toward the next study. We would just say, why is the pH high in this reach? You know, why is the temperature high in this reach? You know, where's the E. coli coming from? Start to examine things that were brought up by our own data. And I told the city council that really, I got into this to answer the question about what happens to water quality when river levels go down. I essentially was still haunted by that phrase, rivers can consume themselves. And I didn't know. And I wanted to find out if there was any truth to this. Well, we didn't find out. We studied for 10 years and came up with a lot of data. And actually, for those of you who came to hear about last year's data. I do have the data abstracts over there, and you can take them with you when you go. You can see what we did last year. We are going to continue, although this is our 10th and final year, we are going to continue next year. I'm going to get some money, and we are going to do a summarized analysis of the entire 10-year study and try to put it in its most cogent form. First, we have to figure out how to do that. I'm trying to remember where I was. We completed the study, and then there was one area which was actually outside of our study area that turned out to be the most interesting, and that was the estuary. The study area was confined to freshwater because that was the kind of instrumentation we had. We weren't ready to do anything in saltwater, and yet I put a couple of recording thermometers down in the estuary just to see what was happening, just see what the fish were looking at when they came in. When I yanked those things and ran off the data on a computer, I was floored. It was like over 75 degrees Fahrenheit in the bottom of the estuary. What is going on there? So we got a dissolved oxygen meter, and we took our recording thermometer down and we started floating the estuary. And when we would drop, the recording thermometer would be like quite cool up on top. And start to go down and down, or start to go up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And then when it hit the bottom, we were reading well into the 70s. We had an inverted thermocline that the last waves, the last high tides of spring would get in under the bridge, get locked into the estuary, remain there, and because they're heavier than the fresh water that was going over them, they would remain there picking up solar energy throughout the summer, get tremendously hot, tremendously dense, and lose all of their oxygen. So when we started dragging the oxygen meter on the bottom of the estuary, it was a wasteland. We found no oxygen anywhere on the bottom, and we realized the whole benthic community, all of the crawdads, everything that lived on the bottom of the estuary was dead. And it didn't sound good. So we did this a couple of years and verified that this was a really odd situation. And we talked to the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council about it, who then called together a meeting. And EPA decided they were interested. So they came down and they set 3 recording instruments into the estuary and left them there for a year. And then last year, Cheryl Brown, the scientist at EPA, who was the project manager, delivered a very short paper on it. It was startling. The estuary is anoxic. It contains no oxygen down at the bottom. And it is so anoxic that it produces ammonia, which means that it's toxic. And that solved a question for us, because about 5 years ago, the salmon were hanging out in the ocean, and they were in the pools at the entry to the river. They wouldn't come in. And I thought, how do they know there's no oxygen there? Because by the time it gets out under the bridge, it gets oxygenated. That that ODFW had to shut down the fishing season out in the delta because people were snagging these things. They were dying in ponds, and people were throwing them out. And it was pretty awful. But these fish would not enter the estuary. And this was the answer. I mean, it wasn't like the water coming out was getting oxygenated, but they were sniffing that ammonia. And they wouldn't come in until it cleared. One of the other interesting things about that EPA study was that as small a rainfall as 0.13 of an inch would flush the estuary clean. That everything was perfectly fresh for like 3 days after the smallest little freshet. The same thing would happen if a tide got in over that dike. It would get under the tongues that were hanging down on the bottom, bring them up, and rush them back out. So, inadvertently, we now had our answer to what happens if you take too much water out of the river. That the one point that the EPA made was the health of the estuary is entirely dependent upon the amount of incoming water coming in from upstream. That was our smoking gun. I hadn't been looking for it. I had purposefully designed this whole study so as not to find what we had just found. And there it was. That essentially means the city is going to have to find another source of water than the Yahats River. Because if they ever want to satisfy an EA, or even, they built a bunch of protections for the estuary into their land use plan last year. They would have to get those out of there in order to take water out of the river, because you cannot take an action which is in conflict with your land use plan. They would be doing something which would be harming the estuary. So I have talked to the city, piecemeal, about Plan B. I know that I'm identified as a person who really wants to keep them out of the river, but really I'm just being helpful here. And I would like to see the city seriously start to look at developing water storage, to store more winter water, and maybe get a reservoir somewhere, or find a way, pay for storage in town, to handle these fluctuations that the city experiences July 4th and Labor Day and these times in which they need more water. So we're still working on it. It is still in play. But now there is enough information that I think the end game is in sight here, that we have done what we started out to do, even inadvertently. And we also, in the meantime, have this huge body of data which we didn't have 10 years ago, which we can give to future scientists who we hope are going to come and work in the estuary. Yes?
Will Nora be involved in this?
Who?
The North Atlantic, NOAA, not
NOAA. Yes, well, NOAA Fisheries is responsible for everything that happens in endangered species habitat. So yes, not that NOAA. The NOAA that's coming into Newport is oceanic. They do mostly stuff, out in the open ocean. The NOAA that we are looking at is NOAA Fisheries, which the responsibility used to be with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they, yes, of course, they're part of the whole permit process. Mm-hmm.
Did I understand you to say that they added water from the estuary to water that would presumably have been, some of them at least, for drinking, and that passed undetected by people in yards?
They never took it into the plant.
Where did it go?
Into the pump. Actually, maybe they didn't. The pump is still there. If you go past the water treatment plant, there is this little green house sitting right next to the fence. That was the pump that was going to take the water out of the estuary, pump it into the plant, and magically perfect the right.
Oh, so it didn't happen?
It didn't happen because they did not get their water conservation management plan approved, because we were beating it up every time it came out.
Okay,
but because Water Resources was ready to accept the plan, the second they'd accept the plan, flick the switch, pump it into the system, or just pump it into the, not even drink it, and poof, they're done. They have perfected their right. We're powerless.
How far above the ridge does the estuary extend?
The influence of tide water, how far it backs up, is right below Carson's pasture, which is the first big opening at about the 2-mile mark. That's head of tidal influence. Salt water goes up to just below Briggs's, where the greenhouse was, probably 200 meters above the boat landing.
You mentioned that you were doing some water quality work on mercury and that kind of thing. No?
No.
I thought you said that.
I was talking about the national standards for total maximum daily loads were actually intended for real pollutants. Our pollutant here is sunshine. This is because
This year.
this year we're fine. Our water quality limitation is the heat of the water. Because we are an anadromous system, our ideal and actually maximum temperature should be 64 Fahrenheit. In many places we exceed that, and the reason that we do is the absence of shade on the banks. So we did, in 2005, we did another study for DEQ, which was a heat model study, in which we went throughout the Yachats system. We took flows at every estuary. We took temperatures throughout the year. At every estuary, at every tributary. We did 28 measurements. Along with, at the mouth of every tributary, we would take a flow, and then we would take a flow at the main stem, where it would enter. We had so much information. I mean, we just had this pile of information. The DEQ, and then we had physical descriptions of where it was. We did shade cover analysis. We spent most of the summer working just for DEQ to do this thing so we could get a heat model. What they promised us was, when they had the heat model up, we could do a flow measurement and a temp measurement anywhere in the system, and it would tell us what was going on everywhere, which was a tremendous tool for determining what was going on in the system. We never got it.
So what about clear cut? Is that as big an enemy as sun?
This clear cuts, yeah, of course. I mean, it warms up the water. There is now, I mean, the Department of Forestry is in charge of that. We have monitored clear cuts. The water temperature is, of course, a problem with that. Our problem is sediment. That we have monitored sediment increases below clear cuts, which are very marked. There is no standard for sediment. I mean, you can't say, there's too much dirt in the system, which wasn't there before, because there is no standard for how much is too much. So all that we can say is, well, you really screwed this up. And the timber company will say,
Sediment will affect pH, sediment will
everything.
affect...
And a lot of sediment will completely wipe out an entire spawning bed. But if you don't have a standard for something, you can't regulate. And there is no standard for turbidity. Elisa.
Have you tested, or is it possible to test the toxicity of the river water, the groundwater, for the herbicide spraying, of the forest lands? Have you found any connection between the herbicide that it is spraying?
I'll tell you the parameters we did. Those are very expensive tests. And Steve Trask did it on the Alsea and did find residues way down below where they had actually applied the herbicides. We didn't do that. What we did was we did temperature. We did both temperature monitoring throughout the season plus grab samples. We did dissolved oxygen, turbidity, conductivity, pH, and E. coli. That's all we did. Those are the basic parameters for determining kind of basic health of the water. Oh, I mean, you can start going way beyond that. We should have been doing nutrient studies. That could conceivably have told us what is feeding all the bacteria in the estuary that's causing all of this oxygen use. That if we had been able to take a look at the possible sources of nutrients addition upstream, we might have been able to say, oh, now we know what's causing this problem in the estuary. But we didn't do that. That's really kind of, I mean, DEQ has all of our information. Yeah.
Did you have to sign some kind of non-disclose thing relative to your triumph before you even got into the courts? And what was the information of your settlement and agreement available to the citizenry of, say, Medford, I think was one of the places you mentioned.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that, I mean, certainly there was no indication that this was going to be a private document because it came out as part of a water right. It was attached to the next water right, which was issued to the city. The city had to give up, amongst other things, its previous water right and rights to other sources that it had in the valley. That was one of our requirements. That all of these, they had rights all over the place. And we made them give all of those up as part of this agreement.
But did Medford achieve the same sort of situation?
I really don't know. This would be a question for Water Watch because they work on a policy level. And essentially what we were doing, I mean, Yachats was the tail wagging the dog. We were affecting state policy without even knowing it. And the reason that they wanted us to settle was to keep us from doing some real permanent harm.
Good.
Has your story, this story, had national attention?
Oh, I hope not.
You know, just listening to you, it just reminded me so much of one of those endless but fascinating New Yorker articles.
But you know something?
That would inspire other
what I said at the beginning is really true. It is very typical of the kinds of things that were going on here in the 80s and the kinds of battles. I mean, this one is nothing. I mean, this is, my God, this is Yachats. This is a pissing match between one person and a city of 500 people. The Van Stroms, who lived in Five Rivers, took on Dow Chemical. And they won. Paul Engelmeyer and Chuck Willard took on the Forest Service. I mean, they took on the whole Forest Service and their logging policy because the Forest Service was going to be going up 10 Mile and cutting way too much. And they were there at the beginning of all of this, saying, you can't do it. And they were facing, I mean, these incredible questions, like the timber industry. I mean, everybody, I mean, the entire country was saying, wait a second, hold on. We're talking about timber, we're talking about building materials, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about mills, we're talking about trucks. And you guys are talking about owls and salamanders. You're crazy. Why should anybody listen to you? It is a miracle that these people, like Paul and Chuck, not only got listened to, but were in the front of something that was happening everywhere. And I mean, mine is not the remarkable story.
Well, you tell it very well.
Leon.
Wayne Dyer, I don't know if you know who Wayne Dyer is, but he tells the story of when he was in 5th grade. He came home one day after school crying, and his mother said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because my teacher called me a scurvy elephant." So she said, "Well, I'll go to school tomorrow with you and find out about that." So she did. She went to school, and she told his 5th grade teacher that Wayne had come home and said that she had called him a scurvy elephant and his feelings were hurt. And she laughed and she said, "No, I called him a disturbing element. As a longtime friend of Jim's, I'm so thankful that he was willing to step out of his role as an artist and be a disturbing element, accidentally become an environmentalist, Jim, who's done a whole lot more than you're giving yourself credit for. Thank you.
I'm wondering if your studies will be, provide a basis to control population growth in Yahats in the future.
It's like a contraceptive.
If you don't have water available, how can you?
Yeah, there's a question. Are you thinking of adding contraceptives to the water? You know? That is what I have been accused of doing all along. I mean, this was the city's thing, is that because I was involved with the planning commission, because I was involved with an attempt to keep people from doing a stupid development up on top. The assumption was that I was trying to limit the city's water in order to limit the city's population capabilities. And I didn't know how to answer that. I mean, no. That wasn't what I was doing. It would be nice if the city did that, but I didn't expect that to happen.
Well, if they followed your suggestion of storing more water in a reservoir, they would have water capacity for growing.
I think so. I think that's the way to go. I mean, we do have a lot of water. We just don't have a lot of ability to store it. Well, thank you very much. If you want to see the data abstract for last year's study, I have like 30 or 40 of them.